Peace scholars have long recorded different forms of peaceful conflict resolution practiced throughout history, but the repertoire of nonviolent protest and claims-making tactics we know today was conceptualized and developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s by Mahatma Gandhi, who drew inspiration from peacemakers, philosophers, and activists the world over. This repertoire of nonviolence has since been practiced and innovated in new ways by diverse local movements and is increasingly shared across cultural and political borders by internationally networked activists. Nonviolence encompasses both a philosophical acknowledgement of the intrinsic relationship between the process of social change and its outcomes, as it also refers to a broad range of strategies and tactics for resistance, including protest and public forms of persuasion, nonviolent intervention and blockades, and boycotts, general strikes, and non-cooperation with contested authorities, laws, and social norms. It also includes the building of alternative social institutions as a form of non-cooperation and resistance. As the repertoire of nonviolence has grown and spread in a world that is undeniably interconnected in both formal and informal ways, my research on the globalization of nonviolence examines the sociological nature of this global spread, organization, and shared cultural forms and practices of nonviolence, and interrogates how its globalization shapes the mobilization of local movements as well as the outcomes of these movements. I have explored several important dimensions of the globalization of nonviolence. My research on the development of a global population of international organizations dedicated to sharing nonviolent practice has been published in Research in Social Movements, Conflicts, and Change. In Organizing Global Nonviolence, I examine the growth and spread of nonviolent international non-governmental organizations from 1948 to 2003. I emphasize how global civil society relationships matter in a number of ways significant to mobilization dynamics and impacts. Scholars of global civil society have long documented how formal and informal global civic networks constitute a third force alongside state and economy in world politics and affairs. Complementing research on the rise of international NGOs focused on supporting human rights movements of all kinds, I conducted a close study of the historical growth of a population of international NGOs focused explicitly on building capacity, support, and training in nonviolent action for local movements. This includes over 200 international nonviolent organizations with established ties to countries throughout the world. My research on this population reveals how these organizations grew in number and in programmatic initiatives, how they expanded their networks with local movements ahead of the curve of the development of those movements and also ahead of the growing global praise for nonviolent revolutions as a morally superior and politically more effective form of civilian-led social change. This historical and statistical analysis is one of many studies showing that global civic organizations play an important role in spreading the ideas and practices of nonviolence around the world, while also building up and supporting local movement capacity to engage in nonviolent protest. A follow-up qualitative study of how international nonviolence organizations facilitate mobilization in the local field is published in the European Journal of Cultural and Political Sociology. In Weaving Political Fields, Nonviolent International NGOs, and the Global Grassroots, I focus on the early work of Peace Brigades International in Guatemala during the Civil War, beginning with PBI's entrance into the field in 1983. In this study, I detail the three dimensions in which international outsiders work in solidarity with local insiders to weave a global local field for nonviolent movement. In effect, first, building new kinds of relationships, institutions, and objectives for democratic action that align with norms of the international community. Second, creating new ideas about who claims makers are or should be and what they are entitled to, or should be entitled to, in a given national polity, and third, imparting new rules and practices for conflictual engagement. In this case, extensive training in nonviolence that both draws on and follows the guidance of local traditions that are enhanced by and explicitly linked into the growing global repertoire of nonviolent strategy and tactics. At the level of state-making, I conducted a study of the participation of global NGOs in the constitution-writing process in Colombia during the development of the Colombian Constitution of 1991, considered then one of the most progressive constitutions in institutionalizing a human rights framework, as it unfolded through a dialectical engagement with local and global civil society forces. In Cleansing Our Hands of the Dirty War, The Colombian Domestication of Human Rights, a chapter in the edited volume National Policy Making, I examine the ways the state incorporated a global framework of human rights and representation from international NGOs into the Colombian debates and the process that eventually brought about significant constitutional reforms, changes that were infused with the hope of moving the state beyond culpability for crimes of its dirty war, at least on an international stage. In Nonviolence Beyond the State, International NGOs and Nonviolent Mobilization, published in International Sociology, I conducted a quantitative global historical assessment of the effect of country member ties to nonviolent international NGOs on the development of national nonviolent protests. I found that nonviolent movements were much more likely to develop than violent ones when country groups developed ties to international NGOs supporting nonviolence, even under similarly aggrieved conditions. So international relationships do matter for local civic movements. This research also shows how nonviolent international NGOs play an important role in major political changes and most often in the very early stages of claims making and mobilization. Of the 70 countries that reported active membership ties with nonviolent international NGOs before nonviolent movements emerged, 68% of them had held ties to these international NGOs at least 10 years or more prior to the building up of a major nonviolent movement. That is, 2/3 of the countries whose nonviolent mobilization efforts were positively shaped by their relationship with nonviolent international NGOs had developed those long-standing relationships over a decade or more before wide-scale mobilization. Of the 24 countries that reported membership ties with nonviolent international NGOs after a major movement developed, 66% of those reported active ties to nonviolent international NGOs within the first few years of their mobilization. So 2/3 of the remaining major movement countries developed ties with nonviolent international NGOs immediately after wide-scale mobilization erupted. This analysis shows that these transnational networks are not just accessory boomerangs called on to provide limited diplomacy in discrete campaigns, as is suggested by other studies. They become long-term supporters and network players in the context in which the structure and the language of claims making unfolds nonviolently. While my research on the role of global civil society networks in nonviolence has shown their important contribution to local movements, my studies on the role of women in nonviolent movements further underscores the need for a wider analytical lens to fully understand the social configuration of nonviolent resistance, even and especially the parts played by those that work on the sidelines or behind the scenes, as well as those who shape access to new networks, resources, and frameworks for strategy and action over time. In a survey of the field of study that gives special attention to women organizers, activists, and women's nonviolent movements, I ask, what do women contribute to the development of nonviolent protest power, given their unique gendered social location? What can we learn about mobilizing power, the power of people to protest nonviolently and gain the franchise they seek when we expand our analytical lens to incorporate women's roles? And how do we account for the gendered but often unseen actions taken by marginalized social actors? I then detail the ways women's gendered experiences present unique opportunities for mobilization, explaining how women in some social contexts use their social invisibility as a mobilizing free space where they can build resistance. That the forms of power women gain in the polity correspond to how they are seen among other powerful actors, and I discuss some of the creative ways that women transform that visibility. I present research that details how intersectional or multiple oppressions define different opportunities for women, and how women sometimes strategically navigate new social fields, sometimes experiencing enhanced mobility in their social status, in turn affecting new opportunities for mobilization. In a study that closely follows the contributions of U.S. women to the repertoire of nonviolence, American Mothers of Nonviolence, Action and the Politics of Erasure in Women's Nonviolent Activism, I trace a selection of women's leadership in nonviolent movements in the U.S., from abolition to civil rights, anti-war and anti-nuclear activism, environmental activism, to the movement to end violence against women. In this study, I discuss the mechanics of women's unexpected power in sexist social spaces and how they used this power to transform the issues they faced, while also taking on the unequal internal organizing dynamics of nonviolent movements, confronting the sexist leadership and power plays that too often show up in social justice organizing spaces, and pushing for a deeper democratization of process, inclusion, and leadership. I discuss how feminists pushed back on male ideals of heroism and martyrdom and confronted nonviolent trainers with the reality of the everyday violence faced by women under patriarchy, these women activists arguing that nonviolence can never be fully effective if it does not also align with women's liberation. In my book, Political Invisibility and Mobilization, Women Against State Violence in Argentina, Yugoslavia, and Liberia, I conduct a comparative historical study of 3 women's peace movements in Argentina, the former Yugoslavia, and Liberia to explain how the unseen opportunities available to those considered irrelevant and disregarded during periods of violent repression enabled 3 women's movements to mobilize for an end to genocide and civil war. In my book, the concept of political invisibility is developed to identify the unexpected beneficial effects of marginalization in the face of regime violence and civil war. Each chapter details the unique ways these movements avoided being targeted as threats to regime power and how they utilized free spaces to mobilize for peace. Their organizing efforts among international networks are described as a form of field shifting that gained them the authority to expand their work at home to bring an end to war and rebuild society. Through a combination of the social denial of their regard, relevance, and worthiness of respect, I argue that marginalized actors are presented with unique mobilization trajectories, and in repressive periods, they can utilize free spaces and field shifting to build support for their efforts, opportunities unavailable to those actors labeled and targeted as threats to regime power. With these 3 remarkable stories of women's courage in the face of atrocity, I offer a robust conceptual framework and urge scholars to continue to develop new ways to analyze the variations and nuances of how social status interacts with opportunities for effective activism.